Spirit. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So we have actually 2 new people here today. Don't want to embarrass anybody, because that's not my style. But Kathy's from California. So, Kathy, right? Yeah. I got the right name, Kathy. And Kathy from California. So, I guess everybody in California is named Kathy. It's the weirdest thing. What's that?
They want the lights on. There's no lights on in California.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, there are. Well.
Yeah. Okay, so we're continuing on with the book of Ruth. And in the first class, the book of Ruth is really this love story between a mother and daughter-in-law. And now the second class, I'm still going to continue that, but the love story changes between Boaz and Ruth. But we're still going to go, I haven't finished up with the first part because I talked too much, but the first part still is this story of 2 interracial friendships. It's about loyalty and this interracial marriage between Ruth and her first husband. And so Ruth and Naomi arrive in Bethlehem. And they come to Bethlehem, they come to the house of bread, and when they arrive in the house of bread, Bethlehem, the whole town is stirred up because of them. And the women are excited, and they say, "Can this be Naomi?" And Naomi says, "Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara." Mara in Hebrew means bitter. She says, "Call me bitter because the Almighty has turned against me." So these people would have known this healthy, vibrant woman with kids leave to go get food, and when she returns, they don't even recognize her. She's a grieving mother who's lost 2 sons. And just pause for a minute. Is this too loud? Okay. So even Naomi says, "I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty." And when she says Lord, it actually is the word Yahweh. And remember, that's a covenant relationship. That's a name for God of liberation. And she says something like, "Oh yeah, the one who liberates, who frees other people who are enslaved, that's the one who has caused me terrible pain and heartache. The Almighty Yahweh, the liberator, has just given me misfortune." She's a little bitter. So Naomi returns from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite. And it just cracks me up all through the story. They always call her Ruth the Moabite. Like some people call me Father Len the Magnificent. Actually, technically is not my name, but I try and stop people. No, you've heard that, haven't you? I think a lot of people say that. So they arrive in Bethlehem when the harvest, barley harvest begins. Now that's going to be key for the next class, but she literally names herself, Naomi renames herself bitter, or bitterness. Now, here's a question. Who else in the Bible is named that? There's 2 other people in the Bible named. Anybody want to guess? Job. No. The name Mara, bitterness. You guys know the answer. Mara. Who sounds like Mary. Oh, good job. You guys got it. Mary's just a Greek. And the other is Miriam. That's just another name for. And now I'm just going to go down a rabbit hole because I like to. I love the name Mary. But the name Mary, in the first Mary, Miriam, her name is bitterness, but like Hebrew works off 3 continents. So there's like the real word for anything could be 3 things. So when when Miriam is called bitterness, it's because it's during the time of the Egyptian slavery. But Miriam is named bitterness not because she is bitter, but because she knows the antidote to bitterness. Does that make sense? It also can mean water or rebellion, which I like. Because it's Miriam who starts a rebellion, in case you didn't know. It's not Moses, it's Miriam. Miriam, remember they have to kill the firstborn child? And it's Miriam who her parents decide not to have any more children. And it's Miriam who says, no, you don't give in to this. Life is more powerful. God is more powerful. As a little girl, she gives a speech that, no, we're not going to fold to bitterness. So they have the child, it's Moses, and it's Miriam who comes with a plan to save Moses. She's the one who makes the basket. She's the one who walks ahead to make sure Pharaoh's daughter is there. Does that make sense? The spark of the rebellion, Moses led the rebellion, but it's Mary who started the spark. And we'd say same thing in the New Testament. It's Mary who starts the spark of the rebellion, but it's Christ who really leads us. But Mary is the antidote to bitterness. It's just in this story where Naomi, she's actually really bitter. She's named herself bitterness. But just the fact that she names herself Mary, for Christians, you would immediately note some red flags that here you have in the Old Testament, Mary in Bethlehem. So obviously this story is trying to tell us something about the New Testament story of Mary in Bethlehem. But Naomi has been a little bitter. She's going to discover the cure for bitterness. But so, did I lose anybody in that? Okay, because you look startled. Anyhow, but it does foreshadow Mary and Christ. Mary's life will be the one that turns everything upside down. Rejected, she'll be found with child before marriage. Rejected, she's going to be rejected by the people of Bethlehem. And she'll see her own son die and yet believe my Redeemer lives. That's going to play out later in the Ruth story. And once again, Ruth, though, if you notice, Ruth is not a complainer. This is going to be really important. Ruth is what's called a Goel, and that's actually for next class too. But Ruth is powerful. Naomi, she complains a lot, but Ruth never does. Ruth actually enters into suffering voluntarily and doesn't even complain about it. Naomi does complain about suffering, but what they found, complaining actually only intensifies your pain. Complain only if there's something that can be done about it. Oddly, Ruth is far more vulnerable than Naomi, but she never complains. Ruth is not bitter of suffering or doubling down on commitment. So here we have Ruth the Moabite is in a new town, and she too is a widow. She's a foreigner, she's from a different nation with a different God. And the book of Deuteronomy, I mentioned this before, chapter 23 says, no Moabite may enter the assembly of God down to the 10th generation. So Ruth is going to a place, to a people that will consider her cursed. Mary will go to the same place, and people will also consider her cursed. That's why the people of Bethlehem, they didn't open the door to Mary and Joseph because they considered it a sin that she was found pregnant before married. Oddly enough, though, in this story, the women of Bethlehem, they don't really reject Ruth. The threat is implied, but the women of Bethlehem in this story, they're pretty good. And later at the end, so I'm going to jump to the story back. Later at the end, the women of Bethlehem first are apprehensive, but at the end of the story, they'll say about the women of Bethlehem will say this amazing thing to Naomi. And they'll say, Ruth is better than 7 sons. Isn't that a great line? And the idea is this. Sounds kind of strange, but as long as you had a son, that was your safety net. If something terrible happened to you, then according to Jewish law, it's your son that would have to take care of you. That's a safety net. Ruth is better than 7 sons. That's strange. A cursed foreigner is better now than 7 sons. And the 7th son in the line of Ruth is guess who? Good job, King David. And also from the line of Jesus is from the line of David. But the meaning 7, and I know I get caught up on this, every number means something, and one of my favorites is 7. In the Bible, the 7 symbolizes several things. It symbolizes covenant. It symbolizes commitment. So when they say she's better than 7 sons, she is the ultimate on commitment. Like the Hebrew word for making an oath is to cut 7. 7 keeps coming up over and over, like hundreds of times in the Bible, in places where people make commitment. So Abraham, where he enters into a covenant, is called the Well of 7. He sacrifices 7 sheep. How many days of creation? 7. What day do you worship? The 7th day. Noah, he sacrifices 7 animals every 7 days. There's 7 high holy days, 7 feasts in Judaism, all that mean commitment. So 7 always means covenant, oath, commitment, and it contains a moral demand. That's why there's 7 sacraments. Ruth is better than 7 sons. This is what the kingdom of God looks like. The kingdom of God looks like a people with unbreakable commitment. So 7 first means commitment. The other meaning of 7 is rest. And so in this one psalm, it says, listen to this, I love this. It says, turn back, O God, return us back to Eden and satisfy us with your covenantal faithfulness. But in Hebrew, what the psalm says is, literally in Hebrew, turn back to us, O God, turn us back to Eden and seven us with your covenant faithfulness. Seven us with your covenant faithfulness. And God gave this family that Ruth is entering into, or has become part of, God gave Abraham, this family, this 7th day blessing. That one day, the 7th day blessing is a rest that will return to Eden. The 7th day blessing is true rest, true freedom, to return to the original blessing of the Garden of Eden. And so, by the way, when God creates humanity, the Old Testament says God rested humanity in the garden. So there's this play on the idea of Sabbath and rest next in the chapter, where Naomi is about to say, let me find you a husband. But the Hebrew says, let me find you rest. Sabbath, the Sabbath word, the Sabbath, or what we call Sunday, is actually noted for rest. So when you follow the story of this family, they keep landing in green places filled with water. That's an Eden image. And when the family sins, they end up in the desert, in a place of slavery. They've unsevened. 7 leads you to the Garden of Eden. Unsevening leads you away from it. And there's 2 words that describe the 7th day. That's the Sabbath. And the 2 words are stop, in the sense of stop working. But it really means stop. For one day, on the Sabbath, you have no master. You're set free. The other word is rest, in the sense of not stopping, but relaxation and joy. And different parts of the Bible, they'll talk about on the 7th day, stop. Or other parts, they'll say on the 7th day, recreate. The idea of resting is this rehearsal of the kingdom of God. What the kingdom of God feels like one day a week is people who are just resting and recreating and enjoying. Did I lose you there? So when it says better than 7 sons, if you had Jewish ears, you'd immediately remember the promise that one day a son from this family would bring about the 7th day blessing. So Ruth, it has the commitment and loyalty of 7 sons. This bond between these 2 powerless women, this is the amazing part. This bond between 2 powerless women is better than 7 sons. Is that me? It is me. Isn't that just amazing? Or you guys don't love that? And I'll give you an example. Like this story always reminds me of better than 7 sons. So one of my friends, their name is Jolly and John Eck. He's a doctor. And a number of years ago, their oldest son, Joseph, came down with cancer, but it was a really, really serious cancer, small cell, I forget what it's called, but it has like a 75% or 90% chance of cancer. Most people die. So something's wrong with Joseph, and it was after Christmas, because I went over there, I'm a horrible person, but in between Christmas masses, I'd drive over to their house, have a little something, and drive back for the next mass. And I remember Joseph complaining about having a stomach ache. And, his dad is a loving, caring father, says, get to bed. Well, then it was like the next month. Found out, no, he has cancer, some cancer. So they tell Jolly that there's like this 75% chance of death. And she immediately turns and throws up. And so they're going to do exploratory surgery. I'm called, I go to St. Luke's, and they had this surgical area downstairs, which to me kind of odd. But I just remember going downstairs. And here's the odd part. It's a incredibly powerless situation. Like you're just waiting in the waiting room. And so for months they had to go through chemotherapy, and he's just a little guy. And like once he has to go through chemotherapy, and he's mad at his mother, and his mother's making him go through chemotherapy, and he's in bed trying to kick her and saying horrible things like, I hate you, why won't you let me just go to school, why are you making me do this? It's just a hellish time is my only point. And the odd part is, like, of their friends, all their friends have are very successful husbands, I have to admit. Like, they're amazing businessmen and doctors, and they're all there. And so that's the males. But Jolly's friends are there, and I'm not going to tell a story like, but Jolly's friends are there, and they're supporting her, and there is a strength in Jolly's friends around her. And all these guys that are great businessmen, they're the ones who are most lost. Not that Jolly's friends knew what to do, but like they were just more present, if that makes any sense. And have you guys ever heard the song, Superman Ain't Got Nothing on Me? Yeah, it's a great song. But that song always reminds me of Jolly and her friends, where, Superman ain't got nothing on me. Real power is these women. Is that buzzing? Yes. These women are more powerful than Superman. They come together, and it's not that they have any solutions. Ruth doesn't have any solutions towards Naomi's problems. All she has is commitment. And Jolly's friends, better than 7 sons. And they are kind of funny, because when they greet each other, they say the really weird things that I kind of love. And so they'll see each other and say, oh, hey, baby doll. Oh, my gosh, you are just a sexy mama. Look at you. But that's just a weird part. But, like, it is similar to the Ruth situation. Naomi has nothing going for her. The only thing she has is Ruth's commitment. And not even Superman has that much strength. So this first half is still a women's story. Notice all the dudes die. So it's a story about women. All the action is driven by women. It's this ancient story, thousands of years old, about women, and women who are the center of the drama and control the story and drive the narrative. Hold on. It's the story of women traveling in dangerous times, women about going into the unknown, about the power of love and fidelity between women. It's a story about loss. It's a story about women who are completely powerless, and yet they have all the strength. It's about a woman who loses her husband and sons, And all they have is this power that is actually better than 7 sons. I love that about the story of Ruth. What we have as a community is supposed to be this power that gets us through. Even without resources, Ruth and Naomi have the best resource. That's what 7 sons mean. That's what the women of Bethlehem tell Naomi. So, yeah, you had a question.
Well, Father, why don't you finish that story? What happened?
Oh, he did survive, and became an obnoxious teenager. So, yeah, sorry, he did survive. So, you have this. They return back to Bethlehem, but they have this power, and Ruth starts to glean. Now, gleaning, in case you didn't know, is picking up after the harvesters. And according to Jewish law, the Bible commands farmers to leave the corners of the field. And there's 3 reasons. One, it's basically this ancient social assistance program. The Bible commands that when the people enter the land, Israel was to create this society where the poor have a way of escaping poverty. They can work themselves out of poverty. So there's all these series of regulations in Leviticus 19 to Deuteronomy 24 about all these provisions about how you harvest your field. You leave the corners for the widow, the orphan, and the immigrant. There's all these dozens of rules for economic justice. So when they enter, they're supposed to politically build this structure that makes provision so that the hungry and vulnerable, they can work their way out of it. So the harvesters have all these rules, like they can't harvest the corners. And if they drop wheat, they're not allowed to pick it up. That's what the gleaners do. So Ruth, at this point in the story, she doesn't understand Jewish law. So she's just hoping to find somebody who will be merciful to allow her to work. She doesn't know, actually, the law is on her side. Israel at this time period is the only country that has developed a way, according to the law of God, that the poor have a way of escaping. Now, as I said, normally you have a son, if you become a widow, is to take care of you. If not, who's supposed to take care of you is then your grandchildren. If you have no child or grandchild, then the whole community is supposed to take care of the orphaned and widowed. So, like, I'm going off on a rabbit hole again, but you know when people say, I'm not religious, I just have a relationship with God, or I'm not religious, I'm spiritual. Well, what is pure religion? Because the Bible defines it. It says, religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to care for the orphan and the widows in their affliction, to keep one unstained from the world. And so, just FYI, I know this, but they've done this study on who volunteers, who contributes to food banks, blood donations, blah, 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 blah. Overwhelmingly, it's a community. It's religious people. No offense if you're spiritual but not religious, you give at the same rate as atheists. So what's the difference between an atheist and a spiritual not religious? Not much difference. It doesn't make anybody's lives better except for their own. So I love the fact that, well, really it's religion that creates this, with politics, this political structure that Ruth is allowed to glean. But not only does the Bible say you have to help the poor escape poverty, but it helps the farmers be generous to the poor. That's also another part of the law. So just FYI, like St. Paul goes off on this, where you don't misuse the church to take care of you. Like, you don't become a burden to the church, is basically how he says it. And what he meant by that is that you belong to a community that helps you escape poverty, not make it up. Does that make any sense? So don't be a burden to the church. And I just think of this for this reason. Like, this is today's culture. Occasionally, like teenagers, they want to go help in, let's say, Haiti. And so they'll come and they say, oh, would the church make a donation so I could go help the poor in Haiti?
No.
And at one time I was like, well, that actually is nice. And then I was talking to this teenager and says, yeah, and then afterwards my family were going to go to Maui. Well, what the hell? If you can afford to go to Maui, why? And their idea is, well, because this is church work, so the church should pay for it. And I feel like saying something like St. Paul, stop being a burden to the church. If you can afford it, great. If you can't, don't come to me. I know that sounds strange, but back to Ruth. But so Ruth says, let me see if I can find favor in somebody's eyes. That's how Gentile countries work. Israel actually works that, no, the poor should have a way of escaping poverty. And she comes to Boaz. So now we're going to introduce Boaz. And it says Boaz. If you read it in English, it'll say a man of great wealth, but that's not the Hebrew phrase. It's actually a man of valor. It's not about wealth. He's a man about courage. So Boaz goes out and meets his harvesters. And Boaz says something kind of strange. He meets the farm workers, and he says, the Lord be with you. What's odd about that is that in the Bible, every time the phrase, the Lord be with you, comes up, it means somebody's life is going to be turned upside down. So really, you shouldn't say that word. And Boaz's life is about to change dramatically. Also, it's a liturgical phrase. It signifies that you're coming upon one of the presences of God. So it's odd that Boaz uses a theological / liturgical phrase to greet his workers. I think it just sends a signal that Boaz is not just a man of great valor, but also a religious man with integrity. Also, by the way, the phrase, the Lord be with you, is so ancient, we don't know when it's started. But he sees Ruth, and he says, who does she belong to? Which is kind of strange, because he asks the harvesters, who does she belong to? And what he means is, what tribe does she belong to? Because Judaism worked by social bonds. Your social bonds completely define you. And I have to say, I love that. Like, there's something warm and comfortable about it. Like, anybody here from Butte, Montana? Okay. Like, so, like, do you find, like, I'm not from Butte, my dad's from Butte, but if you say you're from Butte, I want to know what your last name is. And my grandmother lived in something Gulch. What was that? By the Immaculate Conception. But, like, anyhow. But, like, you can, immediately there's this social bond. Like, if I can get your names, I bet I could find out, are we related? Do they live in the same area? Does that make any sense? Butte people do that all the time. So Boaz wants to know what tribe, what social group she's with. And in the Bible, I love this. What the Hebrew says is about Ruth. Her chance chanced upon the field of Boaz. Isn't that a great line? Her chance chanced upon the field of Boaz. And it really symbolizes that really God is guiding them behind the scenes and puts them just where they need to be, although they had no idea. It's a strange idea that God kind of arranged both of them to meet each other. So in the book of Ruth, it's not, and I'm not putting this down, in the book of Ruth, it's not prayer that guides people, it's virtues. Virtues will lead you to the right spot, the right time. So it's virtues that guides Ruth and Boaz to chance upon meeting each other. So virtue attracts virtue. Ruth's courage and commitment is this type of prayer and action that leads her to the like. So like attracts like. And there's a saying, it's harder to steer a car when it's in park. Just meaning that, sometimes when you put virtues into action, God can steer your life in the right direction. So when Ruth meets Boaz, she says, please, let me glean your field. Well, why does she have to ask that? The law gives her the right because she's Ruth the Moabite. She doesn't know the law. And if you're a wealthy farmer, you could play this legalistic game of, well, technically, and this is true, technically, I don't really have to let you glean because you're not part of my tribe. And Ruth asks her why he should recognize her, quote unquote, recognize her. She says, I'm a stranger. Why have you recognized me? That's a great line. Because how do you recognize a stranger? It's impossible. You can't recognize a stranger because they're a stranger. Does that make sense? But Jesus asks us to recognize the stranger. And who is the first person in the Bible to recognize the stranger? Abraham. Good job. So back to the story. The farmhands, they kind of slightly disparage Ruth when they tell about Ruth the Moabite. And they tell Boaz, she's the one who came back. She's the Moabite who came back with Naomi. And tells the story of how Ruth takes care of Naomi. And Boaz hears and recognizes a truth in her story. That's how he recognizes her. He says, he's heard this story before, how she's left everything to care for somebody else who wasn't of his tribe. So he says, I've been told what you've done for your mother-in-law, and since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge. That's going to be a key line in a moment. Under whose wings you have come for refuge. Now, deep in the story of Boaz is people. Boaz sees or recognizes how Ruth's story is the story of Abraham, who leaves his father's household, heads to this unknown place. It's a story of Moses, who heads to a land he's never been to. If you were part of these Hebrew slaves who left Egypt, you headed into the unknown. In the bloodstream of these people is their history and tradition of leaving the safe and known place for the unknown. It's a hero's journey to leave to a new place to take care of others. That's actually the story of Israel. So it's as if Boaz says, I've heard your story before. Heading into the unknown, taking care of other people, I recognize this story. So he says, how do you recognize a stranger? He recognizes a story. So basically, religion is this call to head into the unknown. Orpha, the other sister-in-law, she did love Naomi, but she can't head into the unknown. It's just illogical to head into a foreign land. By the way, this also says something about the story of Mary and Joseph, where Mary journeys to an unknown land. She takes a chance, and she knows she could get stoned to death if she says yes to the angel, but if this is God wants, even though it endangers her life, she heads into the unknown and says yes to the angel. And Boaz is this great figure. He symbolizes standing up for the weak. Boaz says, don't glean from other people's field, and you can drink the water that the men drink. And he orders all his farmhands not to harass her. She's allowed to drink from the employee's fountain, not because other gleaners could harass her. Well, I said that wrong. Why does he tell her, drink from the employee's fountain and don't glean in other fields? Is because she's hated by the Israelites. Moabites are. And this way, he can control it. He can't control what happens off his field, but he can control what happens on it. And he orders his men not to harass him. He can't do that if she goes to another field. So Boaz is the one who stands up for the weak. He's this type of person who defends the underdog. That's what you're supposed to get from it. This story is not a story of love at first sight, although that may be true. It's not written in the story. It's a story about a man who shows justice to the oppressed. So that's what attracts him. And once again, the word hesed comes up. Naomi says, the Lord has shown hesed. Hesed doesn't translate well. It means like loving kindness. But it's more like the Greek agape of kind of self-sacrificing love. And it comes up 3 times in the story. 3 times. Once again, this is another time where Boaz, he says this blessing that under the wings of God, under the wings of the Lord, may she find hesed. So I love that idea. If you need a mantra, or let's say you're going to put a little ink on your skin, sorry, Linda was thinking about getting a tattoo. Hesed's a great word to get. Although technically in the book of Leviticus, if you get a tattoo, you can't enter into heaven. So there's a downside. But anyhow, it's kind of beautiful because Naomi says she has hesed for her daughter-in-laws. Ruth has hesed for Naomi. And now you have Boaz who prays for hesed for Ruth and Naomi. So hesed is not a feeling. Loving kindness is not a feeling. It literally feeds and protects the poor. It's not a feeling, it's a commitment. Hesed is how you relate to other people. So it's said that God flows through the blood and flesh of his people. One point of the book is that if you want to see the love of God in action, see it how people care for other people, when people stand up for other people. The best example of God's love in the book of Ruth is how love is incarnated in other people who defend other people's lives. Mostly it's women, but here you have Boaz. So back to Naomi. He orders her, orders the people who runs her field, let her glean, and if you have to drop a little something extra for her too. She's harassed and has a hard life. So he makes it easy for Ruth. And Ruth works a long time. She's a worker bee. And so when she comes home, Naomi is shocked and said, "Where did you get all this food? Where did you glean today? Where'd you work?" And Naomi, Naomi does say, "Somebody must have cared for you." And that's when she tells Naomi that the man who owns a field, his name is Boaz. And by the way, Naomi says, blessed is the man who cared for you, who showed you hesed. This is the woman who keeps calling herself bitter, but she keeps blessing people, other people. There's a little bit of a contrast there. If you call yourself bitter, why do you keep offering blessing and prayers to other people? So Naomi is afflicted, and she certainly has some issues with God, but she also loves to bless other people. She says she's bitter, but she's also so grateful that she keeps pronouncing these blessings upon other people. So it makes me kind of think, are you really that angry with God if you keep blessing people? And I love it because it just sits side by side. She's both angry at God and can't help but pray for other people. So to me, it exemplifies the stretchiness of the human heart, and I just made that term up. But the human heart can handle so many different impulses and perspectives all at the same time. You can be angry at God and still pray that God blesses people, other people. Isn't that kind of just interesting? I think it is, but anyhow. And then later in the book, Naomi says, "Ruth, you need to get married." Technically, what Naomi says to Ruth is, "I will find you a resting person." That's strange language. You don't say, that doesn't make any sense. Unless you know the word resting is actually a Sabbath word. It's very strange, but she wants Naomi to find rest. And that word keeps coming up in the Bible, like Jacob, when his sons sell Joseph off and then fake his death and show his dad the bloody cloak. He says, "I will never find rest because my child is dead forever." So in English, you'll read it as you need to get married, but the point of it is that security doesn't come from wealth or marriage. It comes from a virtuous person who can make commitment. In the Old Testament, the ultimate resting place is going to be the Messiah. When the Messiah comes, he is a resting person. So you can read that Naomi wants Ruth to get married, or you can read it that she wants her to receive the seventh day blessing of a resting place, that she hopes Naomi finds a resting person. So then later they come up with this plan. And I'll explain this at the next class, but Boaz, the shocking thing about Boaz is that he's not just a relative of Naomi's husband. Boaz is what's called a goel, a redeemer. I'm going to cover goels next time. But goels, they can redeem people. And you have this thing of Levirate marriages, and I've explained it before. So if once your husband dies, the marriage is dead, unless you had no children. And then a Levirate marriage is that a goel, relative to the family, can, I know it sounds strange, impregnate the widow, and then if the widow gets impregnated and has a child, then the original husband, his life continues. So the Hebrews had this idea that a goel could redeem the dead. Does that make sense? So you could die, but if you had no children, a goel could redeem the dead. And Naomi says, oh, he's just not a relative, he's a goel. So they come up with this plan that Boaz will be at the winnowing, at the threshing floor that night. Now, if you're wondering what is a threshing floor, what they used to do with the harvest is, like a threshing floor is like a level place that has a breeze running through it. So you can throw up the grain, and the wind will take the chaff, the lightest part, away, and what falls down is the part you can eat. Does that make sense? Yeah. So that comes up in the Bible a lot. Or there's a rock on which the temple was built. Do you know what that rock originally was? You know, there literally is a rock under, well, now it's the Dome of Rock, but the Muslims have it. But the temple was built over a rock, right? And that rock was a winnowing place. That was a part where true grain comes out. So Boaz is going to be at the threshing floor. And so she tells Ruth, wash, put some perfume on, get a little makeup on, and note where he's going to sleep. And after he's had some drinking and some food, when he lies down, note that place and uncover his feet. There's something I was going to say about that. Oh well, who knows? I know, because why they would be spending the night in the field is because during the harvest time, that's when marauders could try and steal. Does that make sense? So since he's owner, he'll be there with the men guarding the field. And she comes up and she says, spread the corners of your garment over me, because you are a goel, a family redeemer. And she says, let me cover your feet. Now, what does that mean? And some commentators will say, well, it's sex. She's being very provocative. Remember, she has no right. She's completely vulnerable. She's a non-Jew. She's a Palestinian Arab. And she's asking for sex. That's actually a silly interpretation. Because if Boaz was offended and he wanted to make some problems, this would be extremely risky for Ruth, especially since he's already religious. He greets people with "Lord be with you." So most serious commentators says it does not mean sex. Sleeping at somebody's feet was actually an act of trust. So that's number one. And number two, literally what the Hebrew says is put me under your wing. So remember earlier, he prayed that God would put her under her wings. So that phrase happens twice. And just if you're Jewish, you'd get it. The wings, like your wings, is not like a bird's wings. What are the wings? Anybody know? Because you guys should know this one. Good job, Rob. It's your prayer. You know how Jews wear a prayer shawl? And the corners of it that has these threads hanging off, that's the wings. It's his prayer shawl. So when he says under the wings of Yahweh, it doesn't mean like bird's wings. It means a prayer life. Or in Jesus, when in the book of Luke, Gospel of Luke, the old woman who's hemorrhaging is unclean, believes the prophecy is that under the wings of the Messiah, you will find healing. So this woman who's sick believes it. And under the wings means taking on the prayer shawl, wrapping your life in the prayer life of the Messiah. So she's sick, she's bleeding, she's unclean, and when Jesus isn't looking, she comes and she touches just one thread of his prayer shawl, and she's healed. And then Jesus turns around and says, you tell him what you did. Well, it's not only the fulfillment of the prophecy. The real fulfillment is if we take on the prayer life of Christ, we will be healed. But what Ruth is saying to Naomi, it's a lot more than I actually want to stop there for a second. So what Ruth is saying, she is not just saying, marry me. What she's saying is, Boaz, you said a blessing that God would take me under his wing. You fulfilled the blessing that you pronounced. You take me under your wing. Remember, Naomi is a woman of action, and Ruth is a woman of action. Boaz gave a blessing, the wing, that God would be under her wing. Now Ruth is saying, put your prayer into action. That's what she's saying. And if you notice, this is going to be a big theme, I'll mention this last time, all the women who do this, Tamar, they're women of action. And it's kind of funny because they get tired of words. Like Tamar, words. I want a man who can do something. Or even like, I hate to say this, Joan of Arc said that. I love Joan of Arc. And she says, I hate men that talk and refuse to take action. I just think that's so funny because this girl, 2 years ago, she took Joan of Arc as her patron saint. And she is a woman of action. Even though she was a high school, she would help usher at Mass, which I think is great. So I said, well, why did you take Joan of Arc? And she said, because I hate men that talk and talk. Oh my God, that is it. Like, good job. But the word pattern here also says something. So not only is Ruth saying, Boaz, you said a prayer, now I want you to put it into action. But the word arrangement here is very interesting. So have to do some background. Remember, she's a Moabite. And how did the Moabites start? Through incest. Lot had incest with one of his daughters. And the son was Moab. And so the Jews considered all the Moabites an unclean people. And when it happens, Lot's daughter sneaks up on him quietly in a cave and uncovers him. So you have the same exact word play. So if you're Jewish and you're reading this, you'd think, holy cow, Ruth is doing the exact same thing her terrible ancestor did. But when Boaz then says, who are you? And when Lot says, who are you? His daughter deceives him. Ruth, when he says, who are you? She says, I am Ruth the Moabite. And what you have there is a setup of the same pattern, and then Ruth breaks the pattern with honesty. The wordplay, you would recall that sin, but now a Moabite is getting redeemed. There's no seduction. Even Boaz says, we've got to do this legally. The promise, by the way, is that the Messiah, this king, will bring back an unclean people and make them legitimate. That one day there will be this king that will redeem all unclean people. Ruth's acts of honesty is that she's clean. And Boaz says, yes. And Boaz also says, I thought you'd go after a younger, richer man. And if you're reading it in English, you kind of think, well, she's a hot mama and she could get anybody. But that's not what is really being said. Ruth is attracted to Boaz because of his virtue. And Ruth is also attracted to Boaz because he's a Goel. He can save her first husband. Does that make sense? So when he says, I thought you could go after somebody younger or richer, she's not marrying just because she wants a mate. She still wants to save the dead. So Boaz says, fine, but I've got to do this the right way. We're not just going to run off and get married. We have to do it the right way. And in this odd way, like there's a strange thing if you read that story. Boaz doesn't have any great chocolates, so he gives her 6 barley seeds. And what woman wouldn't be thrilled with that? And when you're reading it, you should immediately think, really? That's a gift he gave her? But, I have to check the time. Okay. So it's a strange phrase, but it's not like a wedding gift. It's not chocolates. He makes her hold this cloth. He says, grab this cloth. And then he takes 6 barley seeds and put it in it, and it symbolizes future fruitfulness. Does that make sense? That her husband's line, you will have a child. Your line will continue. It's a promise. And the cloth, there's a whole history of cloths. The wordplay. Remember Tamar? I'll tell you. She holds a cloth. So I'll get into that next time. But it's this, why he gives the 6 barley seeds is this promise that I promise you, your line will continue. But there is a closer relative to me, another Goel, that I've got to do this right. So Boaz says, I'll straighten things out with this other guy first. But the other guy, I love this. The other guy, if you read the story, he'll say that he has a name, but in Hebrew, the other guy's name is literally so-and-so. It's not his proper name. I'll straighten this out with so-and-so, but he's not courageous. So you could translate, like, in modern terms, his name would be like Mr. Nothing. Does that make sense? And it turns out Mr. Nothing, Boaz is right. Mr. Nothing is, quote unquote, worried about his legacy. And he's so worried about his legacy, but Mr. Nothing does become a nothing of history. Nobody even remembers his name, which is kind of funny. And why doesn't he want to marry Ruth? Because if he marries Ruth and she has a child, then that child would inherit his wealth. And Ruth would cost him. Does that make sense? So he's concerned about his wealth. He's a coward. He's not going to take a chance. Does that make any sense? So then he does it at the gate of the city. The gate is always where justice happens. And Boaz confronts him in public, and he doesn't want to marry Ruth because that's going to cost me. And then if I don't have wealth, then my legacy will be destroyed. Well, your legacy will be destroyed because you don't have courage, is what the point is. And then he takes off a shoe and hands it to Boaz, who then gives it to Ruth. And you think, what the heck is that? Well, it was this. It's actually in the book of Leviticus, your favorite book. That in this, it's a court case where if he hands over his shoe, that's a sign of, you could say, cowardice or submission, because now he has to walk home just with one shoe, and everybody say, you're Mr. One Shoe. But he's not going to part with his wealth, but he will part with something as minor as a sandal. So he gives the sandal, and according to the book of Leviticus, Ruth is allowed to take the sandal and spit in his face for being a coward. But I don't think she does that. But that's what the sandal thing is. So I think I want to end here. Next time I'll get into the concept of a goel, which I love. But questions, reactions, yes.
Why is it
Why is it Ruth?
Ruth and not Naomi? Why is it Ruth and not Naomi?
What you mean it, the book?
No, why does he marry Ruth and not Naomi?
That's a really good question, because Naomi is too old.
Yeah.
But that's a really good question. Because if he marries Ruth, Naomi is restored as well. Because remember, Naomi has nobody.
But Naomi would not restore Ruth.
True, and Naomi would not restore Ruth. But if Naomi gets married, then Ruth's husband is redeemed. So yeah.
About 80 years old?
I don't think it says the name, does it? I don't think it says its age. I don't remember that. Does it say 80?
Well, I was just kind of looking through it.
Does,
It's not 80.
does it say 80?
Well, that's what the interpretation was. That doesn't mean it's
Wow. So that'd make him Abraham. I would probably guess that's a reference to Abraham. That's going to come up next time. That there's a lot in the story that is supposed to make you think of Abraham. So if it does say that, it probably is this hint that, like Abraham, the original blessing will continue.
Did you say Ruth was a Palestinian Arab?
Well, I was updating it. That's modern terms.
Can you expound on her ethnicity?
Well, she was Moabite. But Moab right now, that would be a Palestinian Arab.
I just have a general frustration
Yes, you do. Okay.
with the way these texts get translated. We lose so much because of bad translation. You know, so much of what you said, I've studied a lot, but so much of what I've studied doesn't say anything about how you translate the text. So we lose all of those nuances.
So Rob said, he studied this, but when you read it in English, you lose a lot in the translation, and that's true. And the Italians have the saying, and it's true. Every translator is a liar. Because when you translate something into another language, there's no way you can convey all the nuances. Like if I said, I hope you find seventh rest. In English, that would make no sense. So, we do that a lot. A lot of the Bible, the translation just doesn't come through. You have to do word studies. So, that's why, when somebody says, well, I'm just going to pick up the Bible and read it. Good luck with that. When Mr. Nothing met with Boaz, so-and-so? Mm-hmm. I think... Well, the book of Leviticus says you have to give him a shoe. It's a sign of...
Everybody knows he was a coward, but he has to do it because they go by the law. Is that right?
Yeah. So they're fulfilling the law.
For what he said, for me, it's not so much loss in translation as it is the cultural difference.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm an American born and bred, and I think like one, and I'm immersed
place for these stories to
So
place, which
he-
is not my time.
He makes a really good point. Not only is there trouble translating words into English, but also cultural ideas that don't exist in American culture. And this amazing part, when you read the book of Ruth, it will literally say, oh, in that time we used to do that. Because even from Ruth to Solomon, the culture changed. So they had to include they used to do that back then. So, Kate.
So, on the shoe thing, Mr. So-and-so gives the shoe to Boaz, or he gives it to Ruth?
I think he hands it to Boaz, and Boaz gives it to Ruth. But it's Ruth is the one who gets it. Okay, we still have a minute or two. I have to say, I'm gonna skip it, but the discussion, or at least think about it, is in one sense, I love how either you're a burden to the community, or it's actually community that helps us survive. It's courage and commitment and community, not wealth and political power that is going to have us survive. It's courage, commitment, and community. So I just like that in Ruth. So it's been an hour, so God bless you. See you next week for the last one.